know, it was just like three of us. It was like three of us last week,
Yeah.
and but somebody else joined us for a while, but they had to go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, so you said you got ahead. It's a big chapter, this sixth chapter.
Yeah.
It's
Well, the thing is, I've got ahead because I'm at the point now with the book that I just really want to get it finished.
yeah. Yeah, I'm kind of feeling that way too. I've got other things on my plate and I'd like to get this off it. But it does yeah, it's kind of weird because this week I ran into Scott Shepard the first time, and his he commented on one of my YouTube videos. I think it was the one about Marcus Krajewski's chapter in his book about Luhmann, and apparently Scott is really into Luhmann and is kind of a Luhmann purist.
Yeah, you should. Yeah, you should definitely check out some of his other videos where he goes in depth into his system and how he notes from books and the books them into files from the way and.
Yeah, I've been listening to them. They're hard to watch because he films them on his phone and he like zips around a lot, and it makes me dizzy. But
one or two he does get his wife to film them.
Oh, good, okay. Yeah, it does seem like it's evolving. It's his style is evolving. Throughout the ones that I've been, which is I guess that happens to all of us.
Yeah, and he's also started to do a series where he has calls, video chats with other people who are wanting to start their own.
Mm-hmm.
So he helps them work through setting up their own system.
Right. Hey, Justin.
Oh, hello.
Yeah, I've actually been thinking about starting to do sort of podcast, sort of interviewee podcasty things, and I contacted him about talking at some point. So that might be cool. Hey, Pat.
Danny Hatch will be a good one for that as well because he's a PhD researcher who uses Obsidian heavily.
Yeah, you mentioned it, and I was gonna look into that because I'm not familiar with it.
Yeah. He did started out with Notion videos, but now he's gone all in with the Obsidian.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, there was somebody else who I just ran across again, who I noticed was doing Notion, and I've been interested because and I think I might try to talk to Eleanor too, because she seems to be kind of ahead of the curve on getting stuff out of her Obsidian vault, and that's kind of the stage that I'm at. Is I'm trying to put together a bunch of my these primary sources that I'm kind of trying to create a little ebook of them for the purpose of my upcoming course, and so I'm putting all of those. I was putting all of those into my vault, and they were kind of getting lost. And so I'm less convinced that that Obsidian is kind of working for me as a complete knowledge management thing. Hey, Chris.
Morning.
How you doing?
Not too bad. Recovering, or
Good.
Recovered maybe.
Recovering from your birthday?
Yeah.
Ah, nice.
We're here and alive.
Yeah. Well, happy birthday.
Thank you.
I saw, it was funny too, because I was searching for a card and box set, and I did see that one that you got as a gift.
Well, it was interesting. The person who got it for me, I think they ordered it and got it, and then they were super disappointed because they really expected that it was going to be a wooden box. And it's a super duper high quality cardboard box that's wrapped on every side. And I'm sitting on the desk. It looks like it's a wooden box.
Yeah, it looked in the photo like it was wooden.
But they were disappointed, and I'm like, oh, like you obviously haven't looked. Like, if you go online to find and purchase a wooden box like that, it's 80 to 100 or more.
It's ridiculous. And they seem to be trying to get away with selling like apothecary drawers that you can't stick a file card in as as the solution for this. Yeah.
Well, yeah. A lot of those old drawers too, there's nothing, unless you're keeping like the things that were meant to go in those drawers, they're ostensibly useless in modern life.
Yeah.
I mean, you really, because I don't even think even the old 4x6 drawers, you can't put like DVDs in.
Right.
And DVDs are almost a dead technology. So,
right. Yeah, I'm. It's funny because every time I go into my library at Bemidji State, they've got a bunch of old, card catalog set, and some of them are just, stacks of like 2x6, on a little side table. And I keep telling them, if you ever decide you want to get rid of any of these, let me know. Sooner or later.
You could always turn the cards around and use the blank backs.
Yeah. Yeah, so I've got my little pile of cards. So I've ordered some cards. I've thought about actually, doing the thing, because I do like that idea of having of having a big table and moving the stuff around. And and I've been watching, some of those videos, or listening to them, because the ones that he moves around a lot, Scott, in his videos is kind of difficult, makes me dizzy, but. But his process,
his camera work, leaves something to be desired, I think. But
I think I think initially, Torrin says it's evolving. So I think that it is probably, he's probably, those ones that he was filming with his phone were very early in his process. I think,
he still uses his phone.
Yeah. Well, it's difficult too, because sometimes his phone is between the light and the card. But in any case, so I've been looking forward to kind of getting back. Pat, one thing that I noticed was I really like your map of content of all of these different things. Your posts. The other people's notes that you like, and then and then you're reading. I thought that.
Thank you. I know some people don't like the map of content moniker, but I drew a distinction between that and table of contents.
Mm-hmm.
In my case, I think map is a better descriptor than table of contents. You'll notice I have a table of contents too, but it's for other things, including these videos, repost, and our chat logs and so forth. So you can look at my table of contents as well as my map of contents.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting distinction, and I do think that we haven't spent a lot of time kind of talking about the process lately. So that, that might be something to, to kind of bring back into the conversation. Although there is a lot in this chapter too. So we can spend our time talking about the chapter also, if
maybe the better framing, and depending on what you're actually using your kind of quote unquote map of content for, I think a lot, when I hear people talking about it, a lot of people typically are using it in the framing of a project outline for something they're making or something they might use, which to me is probably a better use of the term, because I think a lot of people are collecting things on a page and calling it a map of content, and it's serving as kind of it's certainly a view into their data, but a little more along the lines of like a Wikipedia page, which may or may not be as useful. But then you're collecting notes, and then you're collecting those notes on another page. And I think a chunk of that is kind of missed work, unless it's specifically for a project, for something you're going to write or do. And then it makes a little more sense. But in that case, map of content then belies what it actually is, what function it's actually serving.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and I think part of it involves, for me at least, whether it is, kind of front loading a structure onto the data that I'm trying to acquire, or whether it somehow kind of organically comes out of that. And that is one thing that I did notice that Scott talks about in these videos that he's making, which he purports to be a big time Luhmann purist, right? So so there is that sort of authority of Luhmann, that's sort of lurking in the background. But he does say, he to his credit, one thing that Scott Schepper, Scheper, he is another guy on YouTube. He has a Zettelkasten system that is paper-based that he calls anti-net, and apparently he's writing a book about it. And he, to give him credit, he has, I think, gone back. Thanks, Chris. He has gone back to actually look at the Luhmann archive in Bielville, wherever it is, and has noticed that Luhmann made what Scott calls collectives, right, which are in some cases organic, and are lists of notes that he has kind of come up with over time, rather than kind of a top-down thing. So yeah, I think, Chris, there are two things. I haven't even looked at his Reddit yet. I heard he had a Reddit. Thanks for putting that link in. Yeah, so I'm curious about that, because I don't find it incredibly intuitive to go back through, and maybe it might have to do with my own ignorance, right? that I don't, that I'm not really good yet at kind of going back into Obsidian and doing the right kinds of searches, and and following links in the right way that will allow me to actually pull the information that I'm that I'm really interested in at the moment out of it, in a kind of a timely way, and organize it. Anybody have a really good experience doing that?
I think, yeah, that's one of the kind of pieces that is the hardest at the end of the day, is once you've collected all these notes, whether they're on paper or in digital form, and you've got all this writing and you want to reuse it, you then need to pull it out of wherever it happens to be, if it's paper, and lay it out somewhere. And if you're doing a book or chapter length things, that may be a lot of stuff you're pulling out. Yeah. Or if you're doing it digitally, how do you do a search and find, or multiple searches and find small chunks of corpus that you're then using? And you can create a new page and maybe transclude it, depending on what tool you're using, and then print that page up. But even then, you're still doing a lot of kind of manual repetitive work, both to find it and order it. And then you have to reprint it or copy and paste it into whatever final form you're using. Yeah. And a lot of that work is just, it's painfully tedious.
Yeah. Well,
it's not an easy thing.
Yeah. And kind of always has been, right? I was reminded, when I got my dad out of the hospital last Monday, and then, he kind of slowly got stronger and stronger each day. And so, I think on Tuesday we went around his block once, and then slowly. And then on Wednesday we went around twice, and on Thursday 3 times. And as we're going, we're talking. So we just spent a lot of the time talking. And and he reminded me that, that he was like the first Mac user I ever knew. I bought one in late 84, but he bought one in early 84. I bought a Mac Plus with a whole megabyte of memory. He bought a fat Mac with 512K. And that was because he was already working on his dissertation on a typewriter, and then actually with scissors, cutting set paragraphs and sections and placing them and sticking them onto, additional sheets of paper and stuff like that. And that used to be the way that it was done, and that it was a big leap ahead, to get this fat Mac and, with the 2 floppy disks, and be able to move things around. But even so, it's sort of, and I'm very grateful, and I think that was a big, kind of a quantum leap, right? That ability to cut something from someplace else and paste it someplace, and I certainly used that when I was writing. I mean, my biggest book project was my dissertation, right? The book that came out of that was substantially based on that, so that really doesn't count as much. So, and that was, sort of a process of taking a bunch of these notes that I had in a bunch of different places, mostly Tinderbox, and sticking them into cards, virtual cards in not Obsidian, in Scrivener, and then moving them around on that kind of virtual board, the little peg or the little board that they have in there. Justin, go ahead.
I kind of feel like we, like all these different options, whether it's Obsidian or cutting out pieces of paper or note cards or whatever, it's like, it's almost a distraction by the profusion of choices we have. And really, like, what we need to do is just focus on what's going to work for me as an individual. Because, like, I'm suffering the same thing. I collected more notes and kind of stopped putting them in Obsidian because, like, I didn't ever see anything come back out of it. And now I'm considering also paper note cards or just get a massive collection of notes and then go back and try to pull out the things that are relevant. Like, I noticed some really good questions in chapter 6 that I want to follow up on. Like, what motivated them to actually go to progressive taxes in 1915? Like, kind of got the general picture, but I'd like to get a little more concrete about it. So that feels like a nexus of questions that I could follow up with, like Luhmann style notes, but I also don't want to put a huge amount of authority on Luhmann because it worked for him doesn't mean it's going to freaking work for me. I need to find what works for me and not be like distracted by like, I should do what these people did, because that's useless. Like, if you just can never make something work for that somebody else made work for them, like that doesn't get you anywhere. So I don't know. I kind of feel like I personally need to like ignore a bunch of that stuff and just focus on what I can make actually result in some output.
Yeah. I think that is, I think kind of that practical element is super important, and maybe, yeah, and to extend that for me, maybe it is being more project focused and not, sort of hoping, this Luhmann dream is that somehow all of my knowledge, right, is going to organically, combine, and that things will emerge from it in sort of interesting and unexpected ways.
I can see getting there, but I feel like I need to start on a small scale project and build out rather than try to like be like, I want the perfect enormous system that encompasses all. It's like, that's too big. I don't know how to, you got to start small, get something that works, and then grow. That's how complex systems succeed.
Yeah, I agree. Tim, go ahead. Tim, you there? Oh, he may be having some technical difficulties. For me, Chris, I'm reading the chat. For me, the Tinderbox was incredibly difficult because there was no, logic to it except what I put in there, right? So it didn't, and I've always been a little bit frustrated with, with the arbitrariness of mind maps and things like that too. But Scrivener was helpful in that I could toggle back and forth between that board with the cards on it, that view, and then sort of the nested outline view. And I tend to think, and maybe I tend to think in terms of paragraphs, right? As kind of the basic units of a longer form work like that. So that was super helpful to me to be able to to have a paragraph, a card was the equivalent of paragraph, and I could move them around, and I could I could kind of nest them and all of that.
I've taken to using like short titles of what a particular card is about, or at least that encapsulates most of what it is, so that I can use that title and create outlines and use those titles as here's a paragraph or multiple paragraphs. Mm-hmm. And then I can just put an exclamation in front of it and it will transclude it all. And then I'll have a whole page of here's roughly the outline of what the thing is, and I can print it out and do it. Mm-hmm. But just for fun, I thought I would.
दोस्तों नमस्कार, आपका फिर से स्वागत है आपके प्रिय चैनल जोल्ट में एलईडी बल्ब्स एंड लाइट्स बिजनेस टिप्स के एपिसोड नंबर 2 में आपका फिर से स्वागत है।
What are we hearing, Pat?
डिस्कस करेंगे डीओबी, ड्राइवर ऑन बोर्ड। ऐसे बहुत सारे नए मैन्युफैक्चरर्स हैं।
But I thought just for fun I would take all my notes from Tiago Forte's book and print them out on slips, and I'm as an experiment I'm going to follow Conrad Gessner's advice from the mid 1500s and lay it out, organize it, and to write the review for the book that I want.
Wow. That's a lot of notes.
Just to see how that works in a paper world, because I haven't done that since I was maybe in 5th or 6th grade.
Yeah,
decades ago.
Yeah, you took a lot more notes on Tiago's book than I did.
Well, this particular set of notes also includes chunks of context from where it came. But the other nice thing too that is kind of an odd, having it in physical form. So most of them, maybe slips as small as this, and the printing is, I don't know, maybe 6-point font. Mm-hmm. But there are a couple of these in here that are, like this is like a half a page of, I wrote a lot, but most of this is my writing and not his writing. Mm-hmm. So I can easily look at my notes and tell there's 5 or 6 that I wrote like 20 paragraphs of things for myself that were more, something in his book inspired me, or, gave me a bit of inspiration to write something, and several times it had nothing to do with what his book was about at all.
Yeah.
But I had an idea, so I wrote it in the margins and wrote it out in full, because I found that lots of times in the past I would annotate things and say, this is a good idea, come back and flesh it out. Mm-hmm. And almost never did I flesh it out. And 9 times out of 10, when I did come back to try and flesh it out, I had totally forgotten what the bigger idea was to flesh it out.
Right.
So now I take that time and just do it. And the productivity in doing that has made a huge difference. Mm-hmm. And at least in terms of creating pieces that I would never have done before.
Right.
So,
right. Well, and that's saying a lot, because you're already super productive. I mean, you are always, the amount of output that you produce is substantial. Tim, you got your audio settled now. Go ahead. Okay, well, Tim, just shout out when you're ready, and I will tell a little story. I listened to. I went on. I posted something today that this morning. I went on this long walk yesterday and listened to the first half of a 4-hour Lex Friedman podcast with a guy by the name of Safadine Almous, who is apparently wrote the Bitcoin standard and is a Columbia economist. Used to be a Keynesian, now he's an Austrian. And so it was interesting as I was listening to this, and I was listening to it at 1.5, so I got through like the first 2 hours in the 5 miles that I went, and I stopped the recording like 4 or 5 times and made myself little voice notes, and then I actually came home and I had like 14 minutes of voice notes, and I listened to them and I typed them up, and I kind of created this this little blog post that was sort of a process for me that was super helpful, because again, I would, like you said, Chris, I probably would not have gone back to that. It's interesting. It does interest me, this whole idea of kind of responding to other people's stuff and having some type of a conversation that exists out there in the web. I think there's some interesting potential to that. Tim, you ready to speak?
I think so. Can you hear me?
There you go. I can hear you.
Oh, great! Finally, I can hear myself too. I think we've said it before to a certain extent, particularly where we've been speaking about the methodology rather than the books per se. To me, it's coming more and more. It's the more recent notes that you're doing for the project. You need to touch them contemporaneously, such that you can keep going and do your outline, at least. And partly because of what somebody was saying earlier about physically cut and pasting, and how when I first went to work, I was, here's the word processing system. That's what we do. I thought, okay, fine. Mm-hmm. And so there's no gluey fingers and sticky tape or anything. No scissors. You can't hurt yourself. Sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And also, I probably stopped playing with Scrivener about 3 or 4 years ago. And in between, of course, Microsoft Word became on the desk as opposed to on somebody else's desk. And the earlier versions had a really good outlining system that visually allowed you to put the heading title, if you had one, plus 2 lines of text, which is a bit like Chris was saying about a subtitle almost. And I realized that I've started doing that in part because I'm passing some of what I'm writing up to people to do blog posts that then get echoed for a repeat in social media. So they want a 2-line, 3-line subtitle that is a bit like what the newspapers do to get their article through Facebook or whatever. Mm-hmm. So I can see that I'll be going back to change things like the YAML data stroke, the stuff that DataView wants to formalize a subtitle to be almost so it's an intro chapter, but intro paragraph, rather than just a subtitle like a book might have. But I every time I get to that point, and I maybe once every 2 weeks, there'll be a dim light bulb moment where I go, oh, hang on a minute, that goes back to something else that I may or may not have a note for because it might be so old. But I might have saved the web page, or I might have saved the link to the web page or something. And so my internal current Evernote system can find it, and I don't have to go and wade through 200 pages of Google response. And it's more and more it's coming until you actually play with it and you interact and it's a bit like going to one of these sort of corporate training sessions almost. If you don't put the effort in to join in, you don't get anything out. And this is almost the same. You just writing or just collecting notes doesn't do it. You have to interact with it. Mm-hmm. And I'm almost tempted. Haven't tried it yet, and I haven't convinced myself to try it yet. But to babies objecting to being fed. So trying to use one of these like Anki systems to come up with a random note, simply because it may take 100 for you to get a hit, but 100 days of 1 or 2 notes a day is worth a stab, because you never quite know what's going to come up. The same way as when you've got a range of experience and a range of ages in a team, it's not the oldest stroke, the most experienced people that always come up with the best ideas. They may always come up with the easiest workable ones, but those that take you forward a couple of steps are often from the younger stroke inexperienced ones who don't know it's not doable. So having stuff from 5 years ago pop up might just be the thing that how do I close this off? How do I finish this argument off? Mm-hmm. And the current stuff I've been dealing with, for whatever reason, is not inspiring it. Whereas something that the Anki system picks up and says, oh, there's 5 or 6 words that are the same in that thing from 5 years ago, put it in front of me, has got to be the way that has to work. And therefore, that's the conversation you have. Mm-hmm. What I don't see in our context is how the hell would you ever do that with the paper? Because I'm using the electronic search, albeit not necessarily me.
Yeah,
it could be an explicit search by me.
No,
find every example of somebody's name.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Every example of concept.
Yeah.
To bring things to the fore.
Yeah.
But I know full well, but I couldn't do that with a library index card because there'd just be too many possible tags. Mm-hmm. You can't track them. I can't see how you can track them.
Right. Well, and I have to admit that my most, as I've been working recently, especially on this new project with the free thinkers, I have stuff that goes back to this period from 2006 to about 2012, right? And most of that stuff is on little backup drives like this. So really what I'm doing most frequently is using Spotlight, or just using doing regular searches of those directories and catching keywords. So yeah, I'm not convinced that that really I would benefit from having it all on paper. I think that probably the paper thing might be more relevant, again, as Justin was saying, for a project, right? And so I'm not sure that that I want to be as much of a, of a Luhmann purist as, Scott Shepard seems to be. One of the things that I did find interesting that Shepard says is that, and I wasn't familiar with Mark Trexler either, so I'm going to follow up on a lot of these notes in the chat today. One of the things that Scott says is he seems to believe in this, that kind of the physical process of writing something down helps to encode it in your memory and helps to build some type of a link. I'm not that convinced. That is kind of an element of retrieval practice that I'm aware of, and it is something. I mean, and even Sonke Arendt says that in Smart Notes, that you're better off handwriting something, handwriting notes in, when you're taking notes in class, for example, than typing it, because it's apparently studies show that you can type, that I can't, but many people can type as fast, as they can hear. So they're basically just, a conduit for that information, and it goes in one side, comes out the other, and they don't think about it on the way. Whereas
I'll just interject real quick that handwriting some stuff has really shown some surprising benefits in the last few weeks. I've been doing a lot more of it. I mean, I think it's still like, you gotta make a system that works for me, but like I definitely noticed handwriting has been a totally different experience than typing when it comes to information and processing it.
Yeah. It's been so long since I've actually had handwritten a journal that I wonder, what the process would be, because I think it works fairly well for me to do, daily notes in Obsidian, or, it worked in Rome Research. Actually, I've been trying I'm not supposed to talk about it, but I've been trying Tana, and that, in alpha, and that has a kind of a very calendary thing. So I think that works for me. But yeah, I think maybe the process of writing note cards would, not that I think that I have to have a hook to everything in here, right? I mean, the whole point of the second brain is, right, that it's supposed to be scaffolding that that you can put it aside until you need it.
On the side of the memory piece, I've seen and only kind of delved into the very kind of top layer of it. But there's an idea in education called modality shift that essentially tells you to take the thing you're learning or doing and move it into another space. So you may go from a lecture where you're hearing it, and then the modality shift becomes writing notes and writing it out. So the ideas have to go through your brain and then come out some other way. Mm-hmm. We don't use it in Western culture, but it's much more common in indigenous cultures to let that modality shift also include art and dance or movement or other things. So how can you take in the information you're using, shift the modality of what it is? And I see it quite often with my daughter in school. They'll sit down, and I remember, in preschool, or kindergarten, first grade, they don't know how to write yet. Mm-hmm. So that modality shift almost always takes form of art-related projects. How can you take the thing you learned and then create a picture that's about that thing as a means of helping you to remember and take it in? Mm-hmm. But then the second thing, and I very rarely hear this, and I take it for granted because it's something that I actively practice. And there's a big historical precedent for it. And I think it's kind of a hidden piece that falls into part of the serendipity question or phenomena that Luhmann talks about, and almost no one else talks about it, or if they do, it's got 20 different names. And I don't see or hear people in the kind of this tools for thinking space or the note-taking space talking about this kind of phenomenon. So there's the first serendipity piece is you're looking through old notes, or you do a search, or you have something like autocomplete as you're typing something,
Mhm.
and the autocomplete will pull up something you've written before that sparks an idea, and you're like, oh yeah, I should totally link that. So there's that piece of serendipity. But then there's a piece of forced serendipity, and the earliest version I found of it in a historical setting, although I'm sure it happens, but usually you're not aware that it's happening, or you're not super conscious unless you're really paying attention. But Raymond Yull in the 11th century used his memory and memorized his note card system instead of kind of writing it down or using some other system. So he would memorize it and created massive memory palaces to memorize all the bits and pieces. Then he created essentially he drew out some graphical things that essentially are similar to a 1950s decoder ring, where you have either numbers in a circle with an alphabet in a circle, and you can rotate them with respect to each other, so that you can say A corresponds to 1, and then that creates one code, and B, or you can rotate it a little more. It's known, I think, as a Caesar cipher. But he essentially used something similar to that so that he could juxtapose idea A and idea B and think about how are these related, and can I come up with a new idea based on those? And he would sit and meditate, and he would use these, they're known in the literature as Lullen wheels, and rotate the things around so that he could take pieces of knowledge he had and juxtapose them with totally disparate ideas as a means of generating new ideas and new thought. And I think that piece, I've seen recently, Marshall Kirkpatrick uses the word triangle thinking. He'll take 3 notes out of his system at random and see if he can juxtapose those 3 and make, with the 9 combinations that you come out with, that can you make, what new ideas can you come up with? And sometimes you come up with nothing, but other times you take 2 disparate ideas and you put them together, and it's that generative process of making new ideas that is kind of the really big power of some of these systems. But I almost see no one, and I think in kind of Aaron's and Luhmann, it's kind of but it isn't specific. And I think that's some of the other serendipity they're talking about coming out of the system, is you can take 2 note cards and put them together, and that may spark some new idea for you, so you can go off in some new tangent. That can be profitable. But there's not a really a great name. And even in my own notes, I think I call it combinatorial creativity, just to have a name for it. And mine is mostly influenced by Lull's version. But I'm curious if anybody actively does that in their kind of practice or thinking, or even in this particular book, where you can take, an idea from here and maybe an idea from Graeber and Wengrow 6 months ago.
Right. Well, and that's one of the things. I'm looking back through the chat. This personalization, summarization, communication. It does seem like a key to this is chunking the ideas in a way that they can be a spot on the wheel, right? So that this is a syllogism, or right, this is kind of a complete thought, and it is self-contained in enough of a way that you can, when you spin the wheel, you can compare it with this other kind of complete thought. I don't actually do that. The only experience I have right now of that is that Readwise sort of randomly sends me 15 highlights a day to review, right? 15 things that I've highlighted in the past, and they are, kind of up against each other, adjacent to each other in ways that sometimes sort of spark thoughts, right? But that's not of my doing. It would be an interesting practice. Go ahead, Justin.
I mean, I think like having chance encounters is kind of unavoidable, because you're going to be having the random thoughts that pop into your head while you look through stuff, and if you're open to it and you pay attention to like yesterday I was reading a book about classical liberal arts education, and they mentioned like the first three arts, like logic, rhetoric, and grammar, and they described them in a certain way, and then it super echoed the usus, abusus, and fructus private property rights from, and so like those two, I even wrote it in the book right over it, and I'm like, what's the connection here? So like if you're like kind of sort of paying attention, like you don't even need to force it. And I feel like forcing it, like the guy that you mentioned, Chris, from the 11th century, if you could type his name into the chat, I would appreciate it, because I want to look up more about that. I feel like that's like you hit on the word combinatorics. It's super inefficient way of discovering useful ideas. Like you're just really gambling that you're going to find something that may be useful, or you're going to be able to turn it into something useful through your own labor. But to me, like, I don't know, did that guy ever come up with anything other than the idea of the combinatoric stuff? Like, it just seems like it's a super risky gamble thing to spend a lot of effort on, to me, but I don't know, maybe I'm wrong.
Well, typically in my own practice, or even in these calls, we can sit and chat, and, if you haven't noticed, about 3/4 of the time, I'll float an idea to see how it sounds, and sometimes I'm trying on ideas versus, as opposed to Dan when he's talking about history, he's drawing direct parallels from things he already knows to contextualize for us, versus I'm not a historical expert in some of those areas, so I'll throw out an idea or try and connect it to something else. Or somebody will interject and say, oh, what about this? And that then becomes a connection that got sparked, because we're actively doing combinatorial thinking here, and we're trying to connect those ideas. Now, whether or not we're taking notes and actively taking those connections and connecting those ideas in our notebooks for future use, maybe not. Yeah. But every week when we come here, somebody will come up with some idea I hadn't thought of to link to something else.
Right.
And for me, it's the linking of two ideas is some of the real huge value to go from, how do you go from A to B and get to Z really quickly instead of having to go through all the letters in the alphabet. So that, to me, when I go back and I look at or review over these calls, invariably there's 2 or 3 things that I would have never thought on my own, but by combinatorially thinking together on this call, I can link things together that I never in a million years would have thought to link together.
Yeah, right. But that's a very different activity than simply taking 2 random ideas on a wheel and sticking them together.
Yes. Well, it's
because we're like guided in our searching here.
Using that lull and wheel, he was forcing those connections to try and come up with new ideas. Yeah. Because if you're in an 11th century tertiary, you may not have 10 really smart people around you that you can do this activity with. So he didn't have an outlet via Zoom, or maybe even a classroom. And ostensibly in university lectures and classrooms, this is kind of what's happening. Right. But you don't think of it, you don't frame it that way. But a university classroom with 15 people in it having a conversation is a massive lull and wheel, and you're combinatorially thinking together.
Absolutely.
You're just not doing it. Or as you read in a book, you're thinking, you see something and I read 10 books at a time, a couple pages here, a couple chapters there, but invariably, because I was thinking about something yesterday, I'll make a connection to something I'm reading today in two dramatically different areas.
Yeah.
All I'm saying is like this is what we're doing here, and what they do with a group that's like got some intelligence is way more efficient than simply rolling dice and sticking ideas together. That's all.
Oh, yeah.
And Luhmann said that as well, right? He said that that the slip box is a conversation partner, almost, right? It's not as good as an actual human conversation partner, but you don't always have that opportunity to talk with somebody about your ideas. So this is sort of a next best thing. I do think that it's interesting that these things come up, and especially adjacent idea. I mean, it's not entirely random, that the half dozen books that I'm reading simultaneously, right? But it is interesting that when I'm listening, I'm walking along and I'm listening to this, this Lex Friedman podcast, and this economist is saying that, and he said some really wild things. He said, like, we didn't used to have wars until we had fiat currency. So it's like, come on, dude. And yeah, it's like, okay, so the 7 Years War from 1756 to 1760. So I'm gonna do what Chris just said. I'm gonna give you a historical example. So Britain goes hugely into debt in order to beat France and win this war, right? And then they respond to that by taxing the colonies, which leads to the American Revolution. So at the very least, there's an opportunity there to say, well, okay, let's put that, let's put this statement that this guy's making. And I assume he makes similar statements, and I probably will read, the Bitcoin standard and the fiat standard that comes after it that he's written in the last couple of years. And I probably will compare them to like Graeber's book on debt, right? Because I think that, that the thing that's lacking in this sort of Austrian understanding of free markets and all of that is the role that debt has played. And so it's not, and economists are always focused on money. And that's a thing that Graeber says at the beginning of that book that I think is accurate, right? That almost a lot of economic history is almost numismatic history, right? And doesn't take these other things into account. So without a much more sophisticated idea of how debt is currency creation, this whole model that he's trying to build as he's trying to explain economics simply to Lex Friedman doesn't work at all. So that's an example of that kind of how paying attention to these things that are coming in from different directions kind of works in that same way, I think, as the Llewellyn wheel, and and putting sort of ideas from different sources up against.
I'll give you another example too that's instantaneous here. So Justin talks about using this kind of idea and mentions rolling dice as a way to come up with new ideas. So he says rolling dice, and that makes, oddly for crazy reasons, makes me think of cowrie shells. So I can search my notes and in 2 seconds come up with an example of the indigenous Yoruba people of Africa had a cowrie shell system that acted much like dice, and they would roll 16 things. And this actually forced some of this type of combinatorial thinking, because they would memorize mentally and using orality things within their culture were attached to certain patterns that would appear in the cowrie shells. But by rolling them out, they're then juxtaposing multiple different ideas based on what the pattern of the cowrie shells are. And so here's an example of an indigenous tribe who's doing exactly this kind of combinatorial thinking, but they're using it with cowrie shells, in a totally non-modern context.
Well, it goes back to my thesis that I argued back in the Graeber book, that everything's random and it's just smashing ideas together and seeing what sticks. And that's how we drive culture forward.
Maybe that's true, but and there is something to be said for these arbitrary cues, right? Whether they're the dice or the cowrie shells or runes or the I Ching or something like that, right? You've got some type of a structure, and then you have to sort of take that cue and interpret how it fits the moment or the problem at hand or something like that.
Another example that I've seen of this too is Matt Ridley, when he wrote the book, The Rational Optimist, he frames it as ideas having sex. Mm-hmm. And it looks at it as an evolutionary thing, with one idea A having sex with idea B to make child idea C. Mm-hmm. And then in the modern world, that's roughly what's happening in places like Twitter. People from all around the world may throw ideas out, and you may see in fact, actually a week ago, I saw somebody do it. They were looking at, trending topics in Twitter, and in the trending topics on the side, one of them was Spielberg and the other was, it was some Japanese anime thing. So they took a screen capture of the thing and said, wow, wouldn't that be a great movie if Spielberg would make a movie on this idea? And it's just total random happenstance that those two things happen to be in Twitter sideline. Mm-hmm. But that then generates a new idea that was like, yeah, that's actually pretty intriguing. I'd go see that movie. Mm-hmm. But would Spielberg ever think to come up with that by himself? Probably never in a million years.
Yeah. Ridley interests me. I haven't read that. I haven't read anything by him since he became kind of a sort of a free market advocate. I think he wrote Genome, didn't he? Yeah. And I really liked that. I haven't read any of his more recent stuff.
I don't know that he's done a whole lot in the last decade or written as much as he had before.
Yeah. So we've been talking for about an hour about this stuff. The chapter seems to focus on, the chapter is big, and if you'd want to, we can we can ignore it, or we can come back to it next week or whatever. The things that I got out of it were, sort of this shift to graduated progressive income tax and inheritance tax, which are kind of the two related things. We're on 6. And that this, and there were a lot of charts, and I liked the chart on, I guess I've got page 122 in my Kindle, that talks about the use of tax receipts in percentage of national income. And before the First World War, you've really got nothing going on. And then afterwards, you got this explosion of this rainbow of different categories. Healthcare, retirement is more than 10% of national income by the end of this period. And this is measured for Europe, which he says is an average of France, Germany, Sweden, and the UK. So I thought that was interesting, that there's a little bit of an expansion of the idea of what the role of society is after the First World War. And actually, again, adjacent, rubbing up against this thing that I was listening to, this Friedman Amoos interview that I was listening to, where he's talking about, this is the moment really after the First World War when the Austrian economists kind of get off the ground and really begin. And of course, he's a little bit of an extremist, so he says that that before that we used to just call it economics, but then economics was perverted by all of these hucksters, who started talking about, social spending and all of that. So we had to call it Austrian economics to distinguish it from all of these other things. And he, and so he kind of puts this pin in the timeline of the First World War, right? Which kind of struck me as odd, because the First World War is also this moment when the US becomes preeminent, right? Where, Thomas Lamont, who's a partner of JP Morgan and Company, goes out and says, we have this opportunity to become a creditor nation instead of a debtor nation, and to shift, the global economy, from the pound sterling to the US dollar. And he sort of executes this plan, and it kind of all happens at about this same time that in Europe, apparently, according to Piketty, a change is happening which results in all of this social welfare spending. So what's going on?
So I'm trying to find the passage in the book where he says, like, the party, like, vehemently rejects the 5% tax rate, and then 5 years later they're like capitulating on let's install these these incredible tax burdens on the wealthy, and like Piketty doesn't say like yeah, people were suffering, but I don't know, people suffer all the time for forever. So like, why now was the suffering so bad that the what did he call it, dominant class is so concerned for their own survival that they're willing to give up all this wealth in order to placate the suffering masses? Like, yeah, I kind of have a big understanding, but like this is a question that I really want to like dive into, like the half dozen other history books I have, and maybe find some other one that can help really make it concrete what is going on in that period that caused this to happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and one of the things that I think I'm finding really interesting, I think Austrian first, and then Chicago kind of follows from Austrian. So people like Eugen Boehm-Bawerk and Ludwig von Mises and those guys. So Amos in this thing I was listening to yesterday says that in 2017 a bunch of information came to light from the bowels of the Bank of England, which had been suppressed for 100 years, and talks about how in order to finance their entry into the First World War, Great Britain issued this huge tranche of bonds, right? So there's this huge bond issue, which is only like 1/3 subscribed. And so they have to, they fail, right, in this bond issue. And then what they do is they have two people in the Bank of England buy the other 2/3 of the bonds personally with credit from, in kind of a circular shell game, credit from the mint, from the British, from the Tower of London, basically, right, to allow them to buy these bonds from the government, right? So the government provides them the money to buy the bonds, and so it, and it is this kind of beginning of, so this is the moment where, this guy Amos says, Britain goes off the gold standard, the beginning of the First World War in 1914, and then they suppress it, and this information doesn't come out until 2017, he says, which may have to do with British secrecy standards, may have to do with just stuff being hidden by the Bank of England, but
I mean, that kind of raises the question, like, can we even get the information we need to actually understand this kind of economics history? Like, yeah. I mean, that's been released, but what else hasn't? Like, are we going to actually be able to make a credible story here?
Right. So yeah. So that is Yeah, so that is, it is, I mean, it's a really interesting question. Do we actually have the data that we need to judge, what happened? And
there's also a compounding as well as compounding factor of what do our economic models look like at the time these things are done versus what they look like now. So even since the 80s, there's a new area of economics that's applying complexity theory to economics. And kind of similar to that, even in the last few years, is Kate Rayworth's reframing of economic models with donut economics that take a much more sophisticated and broader and complex view of what economics looks like versus, the almost, when you think about it, they're stupidly simplistic models from the 40s, 50s, and 60s that, are ostensibly still in most of the mainstream textbooks today. And then, we're layering on loads of calculus and mathematical complexity to economics that make it supremely not accessible to the everyday person. But the everyday person can look at and read donut economics and realize, oh yes, those older models are just stupidly simplistic, and they tend to serve the uber rich capitalists because of their simplicity. But when you think about things like the global climate issues, I can start a mining company in Minnesota and rape and pillage the hell out of the land and extract huge amounts of value from it, and knowing that I'll be dead and gone by the time the cleanup part comes. And so I'll have all the money, but I'll let some other government come in and clean up the Superfund site after the fact. Who cares? But so suddenly now I've got the money and I've distributed it to either heirs or other people, which makes it that much harder to try and claw it back through regulations. Or let's say,
and they endow art museums.
Or the Sackler family right now is we can, extract a lot of value from opiates and not care about what the consequences are. But we're also, hey, we weren't responsible, so we're going to keep our family fortune and move on with things. And
look at this nice new wing of the museum that we built. And it's interesting too, because going back to the idea of adjacent fields, Chris, the thermodynamics has informed economics, right? So Ilya Prigozhin and dissipative structures, right, have become huge in new neo-Marxist economic theory, right? People like Alf Hornborg, who is also a huge environmentalist as well as being a Marxist economist, and not that easy to read, but still, it's interesting how these ideas from especially chaos science have found their way into these things. A lot of the, and again, I'm always obsessed by the difference between actual reasons and rationalizations. And so as I was listening to this podcast too, I was thinking, well, okay, he's making this case against public ownership of utilities, and he's saying, well, okay, so it would be bad for the government to own utilities, and it would be better for free markets to own utilities, with some type of an implication that that's the way it works now, but that ain't the way it works now, right? You have governments licensing and regulating utilities, right? And licensing and regulating monopolistic utilities. Every place where there's, what an economist would call a natural monopoly, right? So in power production, in, cable TV, in cell phone, all of these different fields, right? You've got these sort of legislated monopolies, and then so it's not really a debate between socialism and free market capitalism, right? It's actually using free market capitalist rhetoric against socialism to prop up what, when the Italians and the Germans did it in the 1930s, we called it fascism, right? Not the scapegoating minorities element of fascism, but the linking of big business and cartels with cooperation with governments. And so I'm a little bit concerned about this use of this fake argument between socialism and capitalism, being a cover for this other thing. And historically, that's been the big fight throughout the 20th century, has been the fight, not really between free market capitalism and socialism, but between fascism and socialism.
Or one of the other things I think that's hurting us too, and I almost never hear anybody use the phrase mixed economy anymore, but roughly since Nixon in the 70s, the right has essentially made the idea of government regulation a dirty word, because it makes extracting value from our environment much harder. Mm-hmm. And all the super rich capitalists, that's what they want to do, because that's where the money is. You can extract it out and nobody cares until it's too late. But we don't. So nobody frames it. They all frame it as government regulation, which is bad for capitalism. And we have slid far into like uber capitalism lately, mm-hmm. to the point that I regularly see the phrase late stage capitalism now.
Yep.
But why not instead frame it, instead of government regulation, societal protection? We're going to protect you against the people who want to come in and poison your neighborhood. Mm-hmm. Frame it that way instead, so we can kind of swing back to a happy middle ground, because I think it's reasonably obvious that capitalism is not the solution for everything. But you need some kind of intervention to create boundaries of what's acceptable and what's not, so that we don't have to pay for the Superfund site 20 years from now, or pay for the Superfund sites now for the things that happened 100 years ago. But nobody is having that conversation, because government regulation is, just a verboten subject, because they'll beat you over the head with it, because that's anti-capitalist, and we don't do that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, go ahead, Justin.
So I kind of pulled back a bit from looking at the big picture. It says something like the state escaped from the dominant class's control when they got taxed and the welfare state got built. But now it seems like when they, if I understand this correctly, they have this long campaign to enable the free movement of capital on the globe. Globalism or globalization kind of happened in the 1980s, and so their tax rate decreased. And so then it seems kind of like the dominant class re-escaped from the state, like the other way around, but slightly different, like one fish squeezed out from another one, sort of weird mental picture there. But that seems to be kind of what we're talking about. They escaped regulation, and then now they're using that delayed recognition of the problems that are created by late stage capitalism, exploitation of the environment, to extract a bunch of money and leave the problems for other people to deal with. Is that resonating with anybody else, or is that my tree hugger environmentalist person coming out?
No, I think that sounds like it makes sense. It's kind of weird that another element of this sort of, one of the things that I really liked about this guy Amus is that he said that that a useful definition of the process of civilization would be decreasing our time preference, right? So I think this goes to kind of what you're saying, Justin, that time preference is, we prefer the present and we discount the future, right? And so as we decrease that, as we believe in the future more and plan for the future more and, work for it and save for it and invest for it, right? That this is kind of what moves civilization forward. Now he would argue that, that hard money is the thing that makes this happen, right?
Well, that's almost what Matt Ridley kind of proposes in that rational optimism is we'll come up with some innovation that will fix our current problems by, our ideas colliding and coming up with better ideas that will fix things. Now, how soon or not soon we may find, that idea that's going to sequester humongous amounts of carbon, let's say, or that's going to come up with the solution for how do we, make and store, nuclear waste, those things are not on the horizon, or even things like, battery storage. So if we're going to all have electric cars, we need way better batteries. And are we getting there? There's some work on it, and there may be a breakthrough tomorrow that solves this problem for the next 100 years.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to kind of rely on it, and you can look back at history and see that this has been a really compounding factor for how we've gotten to modern life as it is now. But you also have to be careful that culture and society doesn't have a massive collapse because, let's say in the pandemic, you've spent 3 decades working on just-in-time delivery in your supply chain, worldwide supply chain, and then suddenly that collapses, and then suddenly there's a war in one of the largest wheat producing nations on the planet, and suddenly half the planet is in starvation because of a war that you didn't see and didn't expect.
What are the chances?
So you're simultaneously trying to, I think actually Matt Ridley, he made the argument you shouldn't worry about food miles for your local foodstuffs because of the fact that we can travel food from massive distances literally creates more stability in the world. And that's a good thing and allows us to build up and make more. But the problem is, what do you do when that unforeseen war happens and suddenly the wheat you were gonna get from the Ukraine doesn't show up? You are then facing massive starvation. So the couple extra pennies you're paying for gas and oil to get that food to you is useful in comparison to what you would have if you didn't have it.
Right. Right. Well,
sorry, real quick, isn't that like a black swan Taleb kind of like ruin problem?
Yeah, we're the turkey on Thanksgiving, and
right,
the wheat isn't being harvested.
But it also comes, in addition to that, it also comes from only focusing on, and this is one of the failures or the downsides of the success of economics, right? Is that we tend to start to think that the only criteria that we should use to decide these questions are cost and benefit expressed in in money terms. Right. And so, to your example, Chris, it is much more efficient from a global perspective to let comparative advantage work and let the globally best wheat producing areas produce the wheat and the globally best manufacturing areas do the manufacturing and all of that. Right. That's all economically true. And yet, nations have always worried about food security, right? Because they go to war with each other, right? And because then when their borders close, they have to feed their people for at least for a while on their internal production, right? So there are, and that would be a decision-making criteria that is not based on, on costs and benefits economically expressed, right? That would be, national security, right? Which has a bunch of other values associated with it, and, and criteria that you would use to make your decisions.
One of the things we don't pay attention to in America, or nobody really talks about, is by offshoring all of our manufacturing and production to China, it's not here anymore. So if we had to go to war, what manufacturing and production and knowledge base do we have here that we could turn around? It's one thing in the 50s to turn your economy around and send people to go make, airplanes and tanks.
Yep.
But and fortunately, for national security purposes, a lot of that military stuff is still housed, and even primarily in Southern California. But, what happens if Southern California, being on the coast, is invaded from the Pacific, and suddenly you have no manufacturing whatsoever to pull that off?
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I think it was in chapter 5, Piketty actually starts making an argument that some of this creation of equality and kind of flattening of the wealth curve actually improves the economic outcomes of countries that do it. So instead of sequestering all the wealth with the wealthy, by making things more equal and spreading it out, there is that economic impact of greater productivity and greater, happiness and whatever. And I think he starts making that. I don't think he's backing it up with as much detail as I would like to see to make that more, like you said, if we're just going to look at the economics of the situation and make that the driving factor, well, then here he's starting to build evidence that by making more equality, we're doing better. We're actually becoming more productive. And by that just pure economic measure, things are better for the countries that do it. Mm-hmm. But I don't hear anybody in the world making that argument except for him in this chapter.
Yeah. Well, and then there's also to Torrin's point in the chat, TSMC, right? Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation is endangered, and I think that's why Intel is spending so much right now to build a wafer fab in America, and so there is sort of an acknowledgement of that vulnerability. Intellectual property is another thing, right? We have, who is it who is in at Caltech, and at MIT right now, in whose heads is the knowledge to do these things actually housed, and and to whom are they, who, under whose control might they end up being? There is probably a potential for democratization there, but there's also potential for the other.
You'll be glad to know that it's incredibly hard to find Americans to go get PhDs in engineering fields in America. And large numbers of them are foreign students. But the problem is most of the high-end research that is military grade and military applicable, none of those grad students can get clearance because they're foreign nationals to actually work on it. But it's a massive intellectual problem in the US that we don't have enough American citizens going to get PhDs in electrical engineering or mechanical engineering or nuclear engineering to do those things.
Yeah.
So huge swaths of our students at the PhD level in America are foreign nationals, but then they can't, they don't get and can't get clearance. And that's actually holding us back from making potential breakthroughs either in the basic science that get applied to broader things or in the applied sciences that can be spread out. So it's it's right now in American academia, it's a massive choke point that, another thing nobody, it's talked about in the academy, and I hear it regularly from deans. And in fact, I kind of wish our Rensselaer dean was here, because I'm curious to hear what his.
That would be interesting. Yeah. It's kind of funny. It's kind of funny because I had a little bit of an argument with my dad. We disagreed over, while we're walking around the block. He used to teach at UC Davis as a lecturer, and he was one of the people who went to the Capitol in Sacramento to get lecturers a 3-year contract rather than just being year to year and all that. But he sort of objected when I called. I said that relative to where I work at, this tiny little place in northern Minnesota that calls itself a university, but only has like 4,000 students, that UC Davis is an elite university. He says, well, no, we're not elite. That's not our mission. And he hasn't worked there since, 2000 or something. And then I said, well, and you have to have affirmative action now for white students because they're being out competed, right? Because the people who are more, you can't go just on who's most qualified, right? Because then you wouldn't have any white students at UC Davis. And he's like, that's not affirmative action, because he remembers affirmative action from, 20, 30 years ago. And the idea was, and he objected to it because he argued that it put people who weren't qualified into positions where they were kind of being set up for failure. And I don't want to defend his position, but it's kind of an interesting turnaround.
I want to pull in a different angle as somebody who did go through a PhD in physics, and there's just like that we don't fund the follow-on like basic research career path at the rate that's competitive with what the dominant class is funding in places like Silicon Valley and stuff like that. So even those American students who would certainly exist will maybe get a bachelor's degree in engineering and then immediately exit to industry and contribute to the production for wealth generation versus like fundamental research. And I had kind of actually like a sidebar comment there. I kind of actually observed that it might be like we had generated a huge amount of intellectual property, or not intellectual, like knowledge that hasn't fully been exploited by industry and through things like the space program and the Manhattan Project and stuff like that. And we're just continuing to reap the rewards of those huge, massive expansions of our understanding of the way the world works. And we don't really need to drive the fundamental research further forward. We're not limited by that at the moment. But on the other hand, like you two were pointing out, the national defense tools maybe are being starved because that funnel of brains are being siphoned off to make Twitter better or whatever.
If you historically, even if you just look at Japan in post-World War II time period, a huge amount of their growth and productivity came out in some sense because they were licensing technology from US companies and research, and they literally had no manufacturing whatsoever. So it's much easier for them with cash inflows and loans from the US. Their manufacturing facilities were much more likely to take a flyer on things like LCD technology for televisions. US manufacturing was not going to do that because they've already got the infrastructure and the plants that are using older technology. So it's harder for them to take the risk to say, we'll build a new plant with a new process to make these new TVs without knowing. But if you're Japan and you have nothing, it's a lot easier to take that risk. And that has been paying off, for, the better part of 75 years here. So you can take and have that technology, but you also need the actual space and, somebody to take the risk or not risk to see where does it pay out. And because you're so the US is so tied to older technologies that actually work, who is it that's going to make that innovative jump?
Mhm.
And in our case, fortunately, Japan was there and able to do that in a post-World War II society. Otherwise, I'm almost dead sure we would not have nice, skinny, thin, flat screen TVs right now. We'd still be using those massive old, 500-pound boxes in our living rooms. Now, they might be much bigger, but they still would be 50 inches thick.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's interesting how nationalism kind of plays a role in that, that if it were one big global economy, and if corporations, operated without borders, where's the incentive to be that disruptor, to be that innovator, and how do you kind of get a foothold? Now, obviously the Japanese got a foothold in being given $2 billion by the US and, in that rebuilding program, and being, and having preferred access to US markets for the knockoff stuff that they initially made. But yeah, and then they used their ability to reinvest, profits, and to save at ridiculously high levels, and to do what we would call, what did we call it? Industrial policy. We didn't call it fascism. We called it industrial policy. So yeah, go ahead, Tim.
I was thinking in that element we've mentioned in the past, the in search of excellence, for instance, which then turned out to be based on a certain proportion of lies and made up stories. But one of the things they talk about there is the Japanese small compact car and the way it took over the Americans for those people wanting their first urban car, and they didn't need it to have a couple of dozen Confederate flag stickers and stuff. I sort of, partly because of that, a friend of mine used to work for Ford UK, but he wasn't allowed to park in the company car park because he drove a Volkswagen Beetle. And so the car park is 100% Ford cars only. Right? So he literally parked it along with the other half dozen or so people by the staff entrance outside the wire, and they had to walk the last whatever it was beyond that one. But I was thinking back in part of what we were saying was why Japan was in the position. Germany, of course, has effectively dominated the European car market compared to, say, France, which didn't get quite the same level of help as they weren't on the front line for the Iron Curtain. And I mean, the British Army rebuilt Volkswagen's manufacturing as part of, we now are in armistice, we're going to rebuild and we're going to make the British sector the best going. And I went there at Wolfsburg in the early 70s, just as the original Beetle finished and the Polo and the Golf were taken over. And it was literally raw materials, as in bulk steel, were coming in on 6 train tracks at one end and 24 tracks at the other end. One was leaving every hour, full of cars.
Yeah.
And I can't think of a UK factory that big. This thing was like 6 kilometers long. It took us almost all day to do the school visit, and now, of course, Rolls-Royce, Bentley, and Mini are German brands.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the only British, semi-British operational is something stupid like Aston Martin, and even that's got foreign primary owners, albeit that the Mini and the Rolls Royce and Bentleys are still physically made in the UK. I mean, the Bentley uses the W style engine that Volkswagen come up with, that is used in their high end and also used in the Maybach. So there is no competition in that context. It's all ultimately almost all one company, almost at the top end between the Mercedes, BMW, and Volkswagen. We've sort of Renault now worried about what the hell they're going to do now. Mazda's tried to disinvest. So, that goes back to this. We were talking about the economics and the free market type stuff. They aren't truly independent operators.
Right.
And in many instances, you get, a guy from Ferrari who's on the board at Volkswagen or whatever. How is that independent?
Yeah. Well, and the mixed economy, I think, Chris, you mentioned mixed economy. I mean, that element of complexity and sophistication, I think, needs to come kind of back into our discussion about this, because when you've got Tesla moving into Germany, with a factory that probably has some different characteristics from the one in Austin, Texas, right? But probably does not have the type of connection with all of these multiple types of constituencies, right, of stakeholders, right, that are represented in decision making in German corporations. It's hard to compare, right? And it's hard to say, what's going on there in terms of economic competition, and whether the competition is really entirely economic. One of the things that fascinates me is how the heck is, now that Tesla has moved its headquarters to Austin and Texas is, swinging way to the right, how's that going to work out? Because you're bringing tens of thousands, and I understand that that Austin's motto is keep Austin weird, but what the heck are they going to do? Secede from Texas?
No, we're still waiting for Texas has the right to break up into as many as 5 subsidiary states based on how they came into the union.
The
honestly
annexation in 1845, yeah.
Yep. But they could do it, and they could gerrymander it in such a way that the tiny bits of blue are suddenly broken up into full red.
Yeah. Well, and there's been talk, interminably about California's, what is it, the 7th largest economy in the world, if it's taken by itself, and how does that play? And I think there have been some sort of under the radar ways in which California has been allowed by the federal government to operate as its own economy. It'll be interesting to see if that goes on in the future as well, and in what ways that conversation plays out if we have another change in government. So anyway, we're and California seems to want the not only the Colorado River, but maybe aqueduct to the Mississippi or the Great Lakes or something like that, and talks about the logic, and it's eminently logical, right, to send the water to where it can go to the best economic use in agriculture, like the Central Valley. There is an economic argument to be made.
Well, we just need better desalinization. California has plenty of water. It's just not usable.
It's just on the Pacific. Yeah. That would be an interesting solution. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Nestle is, what do we got? The Po. Yeah, the Po.
The Nestle thing is old news though, because they just moved their corporate headquarters out of Glendale, California. And I think they're in the midst of moving to Texas over the last 4 or 5 years. So
Doesn't
Virginia.
Nestle have a stake in Vivendi, though, the French water conglomerate? It's been a while.
They have a piece,
Yeah.
But really, Vivendi owns Universal Studios, so
Oh God.
They're trying to cover the media part first, and then they'll come back and do the rest.
Wow.
But yeah, it's been a big thing in my neighborhood that Nestle has like pulled up stakes and is running to Virginia now. So we'll see.
Yeah. Okay, so have we exhausted this chapter? Should we move on to chapter 7 for next week?
Like we barely talked about it.
We barely talked about it. That's what I'm saying. Should we say next week will actually be about both chapter 6 and chapter 7, or do you want to focus on 6 one more time more closely?
We could. I'm curious if anybody saw anything that was really profound and new and interesting in 6. I think I saw more interesting things in chapter 5 than I did in 6. And I'm hoping 6 is building for something in 7. So
yeah, 7 is
like 6 had some things that I didn't realize and I didn't understand. So I thought it was a quite informative chapter to me. And
there were new things that I didn't know, but I don't think that they were. I don't know how the impact really settles on me as new things. Maybe that's what it is.
Well, it looks like we have 2 votes for doing both and 1 vote for doing 6. Everybody else want to vote?
Let me see, what was chapter 7 again?
7 kind of continues the theme and talks a little bit about political systems, socialism. And
I think combining them seems beneficial because he does like the figures in chapter 7 were quite striking also.
Okay.
Like, the ratio of.
Okay, looks like Element has capitulated. All right, so both, and maybe I will try to spend a little bit more time in the vault, with my, putting some of my notes and reactions and stuff in there before we actually talk. And if we do that, maybe that will facilitate the discussion.
Yeah, I'm planning to do the same because I've finished the whole book now, and so there's a bit of revisiting and capturing what I thought and stuff that I can do. So.
Okay. All right. Well, that sounds like a plan then. Okay, cool. Well, thank you all. It was great to kind of get back together after my 2 weeks off, and we'll get through the rest of this, and and then we'll see what we do.
Good conversation today, everybody. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks a lot. And I will post this, and I'll post the chat right away.
Okay.
Thanks.
Hope you have a good.
See ya.
Bye.